Thank you for joining us this evening. I'm Jennifer Dye, a librarian at Detroit Public Library. We've had a strong program with the League of Women Voters Detroit for over 2 years now. We present on issues of concern to Michigan voters about 10 months of the year. You were brought into this program muted. Please put any questions into the chat. Ruth Coolwin will capture these questions and ask them at the end of the presentation. And we might again be able to allow people to unmute at the end to ask questions. This presentation is being recorded and it will be made available on DPL's and the Detroit League's websites. Deborah Bunkley, acting president of the League of Women Voters Detroit, will speak briefly about the League and the Detroit group.
Hello, my name is Deborah Bunkley, as Jennifer just indicated, and the League. We are a nonpartisan, nonprofit political organization made of men and women from Detroit, Hamtramck, and Highland Park. We endorse neither candidates nor political parties, but strive to make members of our community better informed at the ballot box. We do this by encouraging reasoned and active participation in local, state, and national politics. Our mission at the League is to encourage our communities by registering new voters and providing educational opportunities regarding governance, decision-making, and public policy. Remember, democracy is not a democracy is not a spectator sport. You have to participate. So please, not only vote, but vote in the general, in the all elections, including your school board. Thank you.
Thank you, Deborah. Our speaker tonight is Eric Walcott. He is a state specialist with MSU Extension's government and public policy programs. His work focuses primarily on good governance, civic engagement, and fiscal sustainability. He will review the issues raised by the ballot measures that passed last November, how they have been implemented, and what to expect in the future, which is changing by the minute. Thank you, Eric.
All right, thank you, Jennifer. Yeah, so my name is Eric Walcott, and I'm a government community vitality specialist with Michigan State University Extension. I'm based on campus in East Lansing, but I work statewide with local governments, primarily teaching best practices in local government management, working with local elected officials and local government staff. And I also do a lot of work in civic engagement and educating Michigan residents on issues related to state and local government. A bit about MSU Extension real quick for those who aren't as familiar with us or who maybe are only familiar with some of our program areas. Michigan State University Extension helps people improve their lives by bringing the knowledge resources of the university directly to individuals, communities, and businesses throughout the state. For more than 100 years, MSU Extension has helped grow Michigan's economy by equipping Michigan residents with information they need to do their jobs, raise healthy and safe families, build their communities, and empower our children to dream of a successful future. We receive funding from federal, state, and county government to do our work, which involves providing educational programs on community, food, and environmental topics, agriculture, youth development, health and nutrition, and many things that fall under those broad categories. Our government and community vitality team, which I am a part of, conducts programming in areas of good governance, land use, tourism, entrepreneurship, and leadership and community engagement. One initiative that I'm part of related to educating Michigan residents is preparing summaries and analysis when there are statewide ballot proposals on an election. So last fall, I wrote summaries of each of the 3 proposals on the ballot, and we did educational programming, sharing that information around the state, describing the proposed changes, possible impacts if they were adopted, and looking at the experience from other states with similar topics. Today, I'm going to be talking about what's next for the 3 proposals that passed last November. I'll be going over some of the things that have happened since November and what might be coming down the road the rest of the year. So as a quick review, there were 3 statewide ballot proposals that voters approved last November. Each of them were constitutional amendments. Proposal 1 was titled Financial Disclosure and Disclosure Reports and Legislative Term Limits. Proposal 2 was the Promote the Vote 2022 initiative. And Proposal 3 was titled Reproductive Freedom for All. I'll do a brief overview of each of those, as well as kind of where things stand and what still needs to happen this year. So Proposal 1, financial disclosure reports and legislative term limits. This was approved by voters with 66% voting in favor. The proposal changed term limits for state legislators from the previous 3 2-year terms or 6 years total in the state house and up to 2 4-year terms or 8 years total in the state Senate to a combined 12 years maximum. So the total possible number of years that a lawmaker can serve in the legislature actually was reduced from 14 to 12, but it provides lawmakers with more flexibility in how they serve that. A lawmaker could now serve 6 2-year terms in the House if they choose to, or 3 4-year terms in the Senate, or some combination that comes up to 12 years but not exceeding 12 years. The proposal also requires the governor, lieutenant governor, secretary of state, and state legislators to file annual financial disclosure reports. The proposal contained some specifics on what needed to be in those reports, but required the legislature to adopt implementing legislation, laying out a lot of the details for what the reports require, what penalties that would be for not filing reports, and things of that nature. At a minimum, the constitutional amendment requires that the reports include a description of assets, sources of earned and unearned income, description of liabilities, positions that lawmakers currently hold other than their role with the state, agreements or arrangements for future employment or a leave of absence while serving as a legislator or state officer, gifts that are received, travel payments or reimbursements that are reported by a lobbyist or a lobbyist agent, and any payments that are made to a charity by a lobbyist in lieu of honoraria. Those are the items that the constitutional amendment requires to be included in those financial disclosure reports. The legislature could choose to include more or more detail about how those things need to be reported. So as I mentioned with Proposal 1, the constitutional amendment that was approved requires implementing legislation that specifies a lot of the detail for what's required in those financial disclosure reports, how those reports are handled, if there are any penalties for not filing or for not being honest in filing, a lot of the detail that was not specified in the constitutional amendment language. The implementing legislation here is very much a work in progress. No bills have been introduced yet, though there are conversations going on in the legislature and bills are reportedly being drafted. We've heard from committee chairs saying that they're working on legislation that would implement the financial disclosure report requirements, but we haven't seen any actually bills yet introduced. There haven't been any committee hearings on this topic. The constitutional amendment requires that financial disclosure reports are filed beginning in 2024. So there is a short deadline for when the legislation needs to be adopted. The amendment instructs the Department of State to collect and to publish the filings on the internet, but any verification of the information, any follow-up, again, if there's any penalties, or really anything beyond that the Secretary of State collects and publishes the filings, anything beyond that depends on what legislation is adopted and what funding might be included in that legislation to carry out those activities. If the legislature were to fail to adopt legislation implementing the amendment, any Michigan resident beginning January 1 of 2024 could file a lawsuit against the state, against the legislature for not fulfilling that constitutional requirement, in which case it may proceed through the courts to decide what the filing needs to look like for the year 2024. We expect that the legislature will adopt some implementing legislation at some point to specify the details for the process for filing the reports, what's in them, what happens if there's conflict of interest that's identified, different issues like that. But at this point, we just don't know. There's a lot of unknowns. We know they will be required to file a form. We know the minimum of what's required, but not much more than that. I will note that there have been comments from some of the lawmakers involved in the drafting of the legislation that they see the requirements in the constitutional amendment as kind of a minimum or a baseline, and they want to go above and beyond in terms of what's required in these financial disclosure reports. They have the authority to do that, certainly. It would just be a matter of convincing a majority of their colleagues in the State House and the State Senate, and then getting the governor to sign off and write that into law. So there seems to be interest in increasing the financial transparency in the legislature. But it remains to be seen what that's going to actually look like. One big question related to the financial disclosure reports is whether they will include or be passed alongside an expansion of the Freedom of Information Act, or FOIA. Lawmakers on both sides have talked for years about expanding FOIA to include the legislature and the governor's office, neither of which are currently subject to FOIA, but they haven't been able to get majority support to do that. There is some speculation that with legislation to implement financial disclosure reports, which increase transparency, they could get that done this term, maybe alongside those laws. Again, it remains to be seen, and we'll have to kind of keep track of that throughout the rest of this year to see what the legislature decides to do with it. A bit of background, just kind of for your information on financial disclosure rules. Michigan's really a late adopter to financial disclosure rules. Prior to the adoption of Proposal 1, Michigan was one of only 2 states that did not have financial disclosure requirements for elected officials. The other state, now the only one without some sort of financial disclosure requirement, is Idaho. Rules vary greatly in other states, but most require at least the disclosure of income, personal services, gifts, and honoraria, all of which are included in the constitutional amendment that was adopted in Michigan. Financial disclosure laws are generally intended to enable the public or an oversight body to evaluate potential conflicts of interest that a legislator may hold. They're intended to deter corruption and to increase public confidence in government. Because Michigan has had no financial disclosure requirements, state lawmakers so far have had to police themselves and self-disclose potential conflicts, which really rarely happens. Instead, there are multiple examples of Michigan lawmakers voting on bills even after they've admitted a conflict of interest. According to the Center for Public Integrity, from 2009 to 2017, the Michigan House of Representatives voted on more than 10,000 bills. In that period, 25 state representatives disclosed a total of 38 potential conflicts of interest. 5 of them still voted on bills in which they had noted a conflict. During the same period, the Senate voted on almost 6,000 bills, and only 3 senators disclosed possible conflicts, and 2 of them voted on the bills anyways, making it pretty clear that the self-policing wasn't accomplishing very much. Again, since we don't have the bills yet to give an idea what the legislature might include in the new requirements beyond the constitutional amendment, we don't really know to what degree transparency will improve.
I'm sorry. I didn't mean.
But there will at least be steps towards illuminating the financial interests and potential conflicts of interest of elected officials in Michigan. So moving on to Proposal 2. Proposal 2 was the Promote the Vote 2022 constitutional amendment. This expanded on some of the provisions in the 2018 constitutional amendment, which provided for no reason absentee voting, automatic voter registration, and some other provisions. This constitutional amendment was approved with 60% voting in favor, and it added several provisions regarding elections to the state constitution, including the option to permanently register to receive an absentee ballot, state-funded ballot drop boxes, and early in-person voting. So the constitutional amendment also requires some implementing legislation to get all the details in place. And there's a lot of different pieces moving through, and some of them currently working their way through the legislature today as we speak. Some bills have been adopted or partially adopted. Some are currently in committee and could be voted on yet this week. There's again a pretty tight timeline for this, as it needs to be in place to prepare for the presidential primary in February of 2024. And local clerks have said they would like to be able to offer early voting in any elections this fall, kind of as a test run or a pilot for the elections next year. One bill that has been voted on in the Senate but still needs approval in the House is Senate Bill 339, which creates a state-funded electronic ballot tracking system for absent voter applications and ballots. This is a state-funded system that would be used by local clerks as they send and receive absent voter ballots and applications. Voters could look up the status of their application or their ballot. Some communities had this in place previously. I know last year I was able to, when I mailed in my application, I could, a few days later went online and checked, and oh, sure enough, application had been received. My ballot's in the mail. I should expect to see it by a certain date. Some communities had that, some did not. This is going to be a statewide system. Senate Bill 259 allows ballots from military members and family overseas to be counted as long as they're postmarked by election day and received within 6 days after the election. That bill was actually signed into law earlier this year. And then the bulk of it, there are two different bill packages that are identical bills that are in the House and the Senate. They had committee hearings last week, and the Senate, and actually I think both committees voted on those bills today to send those to the full House and the full Senate. Those are Senate bills 367 through 374 and House bills 4695 through 4702. Those are 8 identical bills in each chamber. Again, those were voted on in the elections committees today, Tuesday, and reports are that they could be voted on in the Senate at least as early as Wednesday. So it's kind of a rapidly changing environment. Hopefully nothing too drastic changes before this gets out. But in the next few slides, I'll kind of go over a little bit about what's in some of those bills. So the legislation that's currently being considered lays out a lot of the details for implementing provisions that are in the constitutional amendment related to voting. A quick overview, they include clarification of early voting procedures for local units and penalties for violations of this legislation. They establish a permanent absentee voter application, meaning you can apply one time to receive an absentee ballot for all future elections, rather than having to fill out an absent voter application for each election. Another requirement in the amendment is that the state is now paying postage for your ballot. So if you receive an absentee ballot, it'll have return postage, so you don't have to pay for that. Previously, again, it was some communities did this. They included a stamp in the mail when you sent an absentee ballot in. Some you had to pay your postage yourself. These bills also clarify penalties for things like forging signatures on ballots. They establish rules for state-funded drop boxes. They expand the acceptable voter identification options and expand the cap on voters per precinct. So early voting is the thing getting a lot of attention right now, and it's probably the biggest change that has to be implemented, both in terms of what our local clerks have to do to implement, and also what the experience of voters will be. Many other provisions are expanding existing practices or making minor changes, while early in-person voting really is kind of the big change. The proposed legislation, again, we're talking about proposed legislation to implement the already approved constitutional amendment. It would require at least 9 consecutive days of early voting. That's in the constitutional amendment, and up to 29. Again, that's also in the constitutional amendment. What the proposed legislation would do is basically leave it up to the local clerk to decide where in that range a community would end up. So some county clerks and city clerks I've already heard saying, we're going to do 29. We're going to give people as many early days as possible to vote. Some have already said, we're going to do 9. And I imagine there will be a number of them in between. Unlike in the past, where the only option was to drop off your absentee ballot if you wanted to vote early, now you'll be able to walk into a polling location as if on election day and cast a ballot directly into the tabulator. There's also a proposal to allow voters who fill out an absentee ballot to enter it directly into a tabulator at an early voting site. So rather than put your absentee ballot in the drop box or put it in the mail, you could bring that ballot into the early voting site and put it in the tabulator like on election day. These changes are expected to greatly speed up processing and counting of votes on election day, since more votes can go into that tabulator earlier, which should mean we also get earlier results on election day rather than hopefully waiting late into the night or multiple days, as we've seen in recent elections. Results still cannot be generated until after the polls close. That doesn't change, but that earlier voting speeds up the process because they're able to process the votes. They just can't do the actual counting or generate the totals. And it would be a felony to publish the results early. There's a lot of local flexibility built into the proposed early voting rules, but there will be 3 kind of basic approaches that are available. Municipalities can offer early voting on their own. They could partner with a neighboring municipality and share polling location for early voting, or they could be part of a county-based approach. Locations that serve multiple municipalities would have separate tabulators for each municipality. This will also almost certainly mean new precinct locations for most voters, at least for early voting. Since many election day polling locations are at churches or schools, those won't be available for the entire early voting period. The local clerks will have to find alternatives, likely including local government buildings. For example, I know of one county that has talked about a central county-wide early voting location at the county administration building that would serve all municipalities that choose the county-based approach rather than hosting their own early voting sites. A bit of background on early voting in other states, since again, that's kind of the biggest change that we're seeing with this legislation to implement the constitutional amendment. There's 19 states that currently have in-person early voting period, while 46 states allow early voting in some form, including by mail or absentee. Early voting periods range in length from 3 days to 46 days of early voting, the average being 20 days. Early voting in some states begins as early as 50 days before the election, or as late as just a Friday before the election, with the average being 27 days before the election. And then typically early voting ends just a few days before election day. Interestingly, Florida, which has become known recently for posting its results very quickly after the close of polls, has a similar early voting period compared to what's coming for Michigan next year, likely. So that's, if you're looking for how that might affect when we find results, Florida might be an example to look to. And experts estimate that going forward, a third of ballots are likely to be cast in person on election day, a third of them absentee in terms of voting in the mail, and a third of those being that early in-person voting. A few other key provisions in the legislation. So acceptable forms of voter ID have been expanded to include identification from an educational institution, as well as one from a local government. The state will fund drop boxes for absentee ballots across the state. There'll be at least one per city or township, and at least one for every 15,000 registered voters in a city or township. These are requirements that are in the constitutional amendment. The proposed legislation clarifies the rules for the drop boxes, requirements about where they may be placed, how to keep them secure, who has access to them, things like that. And then precinct sizes are also going to be allowed to increase from 2,999 voters per precinct to 5,000 voters per precinct. That's because with the expected increase in early voting and the increase in absentee voting in recent years, fewer people are showing up on election day. And so increasing precinct size allows for some consolidation and keeps precincts active rather than staffing and finding volunteers for a building that's going to be mostly empty throughout the day. There are a few challenges that have come up related to implementation of this constitutional amendment. First, local clerks are trying to prepare to implement the changes, but can't really do that until the implementing legislation is signed into law. This includes changes to processes, but also funding requests they're making to local units of government. Their clerks are attempting to make plans for 2024 based on constitutional language, but they need that final legislative language in order to really start implementing those changes and knowing exactly what they're planning for, which is why there's kind of the urgency to get these proposals through the legislature and signed into law so that everyone has a concrete idea of what they're basing those plans on for next year. There will be some increased costs with these changes. Most of that will be costs to the state rather than local government, but there will certainly be some costs to local government. The Secretary of State has estimated at the state level about $60 million in new costs for implementing these changes in the first year, and then about $20 million per year going forward. And that's again for the things like drop boxes, the tracking system for absentee ballots, postage for the ballots, staffing polling locations for early voting, all these kinds of things that are new and added in terms of voting. One big challenge that's been identified by local clerks has been the need for additional staff. This has already been a challenge in recent years with increased hostility toward local clerks and contention around elections and pressure on election workers. Clerks have reported having a harder time finding people to work the polls on election day. And additional voting days is going to create more work for existing staff or requires hiring new staff. So those are kind of some of those challenges. This plan appears to be, again, to get legislation approved so that clerks can implement many of these changes for local elections this fall, where turnout's a little bit lower, there might be a little bit less pressure and less stress with it, as a test run before the presidential primary in February, and then the general election next year. One piece of related legislation that isn't directly tied to Proposal 2, it's not, there's no direct connection to what was in the constitutional amendment, It doesn't implement anything in the amendment directly, but it's really strongly tied to the issue of voting and how we count ballots. It has to do with early processing of absentee ballots. So currently in Michigan, clerks cannot begin processing absentee ballots until 7 a.m. on election day. At that point, they begin processing them, entering them in the tabulators to be counted. Beginning in 2022, so the last election that we had, clerks could pre-process ballots, meaning they could verify voter signatures. They could open the outer return envelope, but not remove the ballot from its secrecy sleeve. So that sped up the process of tabulating ballots on election day. They had already done the signature verification and gotten ballots ready for processing, but they still couldn't begin actual processing until 7 a.m. on election day when the polls opened. So there was reports actually just today of new legislation being introduced, and it's not 100% clear yet what it would allow. But just for kind of an example, there's 10 states, including Florida, that actually allow counting of absentee ballots as they come in. So as soon as a ballot comes in, they verify the signature, open that ballot up and feed it into the tabulator as if it's being cast as an early vote. So there's 10 states that allow that. They do make it a crime to release those results early to protect against results getting out early. But they allow that, and that greatly speeds up the kind of the counting on election day and processing of results. So that's something to look for. It could be something really soon with the rest of this package. It could be something that comes a little bit later down the road. So proposal 3, which was approved with 57% of voters in favor. As a quick overview, this established an individual right to reproductive freedom. And there's a longer definition of what that means, but that was kind of the general focus. It also allows the state to regulate abortion after the point of fetal viability, which is generally considered to be around 23 or 24 weeks of gestational age. The amendment does not allow, though, the state to prohibit abortion if it's deemed medically necessary to protect a patient's life or physical or mental health. There's been some related legislation that's passed so far this term. The 1931 abortion ban, which was made unconstitutional by the adoption of Proposal 3, was repealed. Also, Senate Bill 147 modified the Elliott-Larsen Civil Rights Act to expand protections from workplace discrimination to those who have an abortion. That was signed into law. And that simply aligns Michigan with language already in the Federal Pregnancy Discrimination Act. And that's really all that we've seen so far as legislation. There are some questions hanging out there about what other laws might be impacted by this amendment. So far, there hasn't been any action on any of those issues. It wouldn't be shocking to see some legislation related to some of those questions, or maybe even court cases at some point seeking clarification. But so far, really just the repeal of that original ban, which was made unconstitutional by the amendment anyways, and then the Elliott-Larsen Civil Rights Act expansion are really just the two pieces of legislation we've seen related to Proposal 3. So what's next? I've kind of already touched on this a little bit, but just for a quick review, on Proposal 1, what's next is kind of a lot. Financial disclosure legislation needs to be introduced. It needs to be adopted in time to meet that deadline at the end of this year. Either way, lawmakers will be required to submit some sort of financial disclosure report beginning in 2024. But without the implementing legislation, that leaves a lot more questions than answers. So there's a lot of work to be done for Proposal 1. For Proposal 2, committees, again, as I said, took action this week. Today, there were votes in committee. And what I was reading earlier today is that they could vote in the Senate or in the House as early as tomorrow on Wednesday. So we could see those bills through the House and through the Senate within the coming days. And then I imagine the governor would sign them into law pretty quickly. That would be good news for local clerks whose job it is to implement all these changes. Because again, then if they have local elections this fall, they can begin implementing those required changes and preparing for what's going to be much bigger turnout with the presidential primary and the elections coming next year. So these are a list of resources if you're looking to read more about some of these topics, particularly about financial disclosure and voting changes. I'll share this PowerPoint so that you can copy these links directly if you're interested. The first link here, legislature.mi.gov. You can put in any of the bill numbers that I referenced earlier and get updates on what's happened with the bill, plus analysis from the House or Senate Fiscal Agency. It's a great way to track kind of what, if a bill's been, once a bill's been introduced, has it had a committee hearing? Is it being voted on? Those types of things. It's a great resource. So I'd encourage you to check that out. And with that, I just want to, say thanks for having me here today. And I'm happy to take any questions that you might have on any of this.
Thank you, Eric.
Yeah. So we have a couple questions here. The first is about the first proposal, 2022-1. Is there a partisan divide on enabling legislation to implement that proposal? Are there differences on either side of the aisle about how to implement that?
So there has been some. I didn't get a chance to look today in committees on what the breakdown was in vote. But I've seen, on the Democratic side, at least so far, it's been pretty much completely in support of this legislation. And then I've seen some Republicans come out in favor of the legislation implementing, and some Republicans expressing concerns with some of the legislation. So there is some partisan divide, but broadly, I think part of what helps bring some unity in this one is that the constitutional amendment requires this legislation to go through, and so there's kind of guardrails that they're already stuck in between, and it's just kind of figuring out some of the details. So there may be individual issues that there's some disagreement about how to implement a certain piece of something. I just saw one comment from a state senator who was concerned that, allowing a range from 9 to 29 early voting days could provide unequal opportunity to vote for residents. And the legislation allows the choice by the local clerk for how to implement that. And voters also still have the chance to do absentee voting, do their, ballot drop box, if a community chooses to only have the 9 days of early voting. So hopefully that access is still there. But there have been some concerns like that, but not, it'll be interesting to see when the vote happens in the full chamber, what that looks like.
Thank you. And there's also a couple questions here about that promote the vote proposal. Is there any research to show the impact of early voting on voter turnout in other states?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm actually trying to pull up the summary that I wrote last fall to see real quick if there was something in there. I don't know off the top of my head. That'd be something I'd have to look at. What I do know is that early voting, my sense is that it did have a slight impact or maybe even great impact on turnout. What I can say confidently is I know that it significantly speeds up the availability of results, because they're able, those votes on that early voting sites are going directly into the tabulators, just like on election day. And so that makes counting them on election day a lot quicker. Florida is a really strong example of this, where in the last few years, within minutes after the polls close, we're seeing like 2/3 of precincts reporting already, because that transition just happens more quickly. So that's one really strong impact. I know there is a positive impact on turnout. I don't have that in front of me for what that is, though.
Great, thanks. Yeah. The other question I have is relating to the changes in early voting locations. So is there any rule in how far a voting place can be from a voter? So with like the precinct or with the tabulators? And then specifically, if there is there a plan for transit to those locations that would be much further away than our normal precincts today are?
That's something that I haven't seen yet in the legislation. I know, again, there's one county that I know of that one plan was to have kind of a central county-wide early voting site. That's going to be where it comes to kind of the local clerk's discretion. Do they say, it's really important to our community that we have a precinct for early voting that's in our city, in our township, whatever that is, or do they choose to work with the county? The intent is that there would be a county-wide approach to try and make that accessible to everybody. And so hopefully there'll be some thought put into that. But I don't know for sure.
Okay, I've got a couple more that have come in. So you mentioned an option of tabulating their own absentee ballots. Is it an option now, or is that part of the pending legislation?
Yeah, so that would be the pending legislation. Currently, if you have an absentee ballot, you can drop that in the ballot drop box. You can go turn it into your local clerk's office, but you turn it in that sealed absentee ballot envelope. The proposed change is that you could take that ballot to an early voting site and put it into the tabulator, just like when you show up on election day and fill out your ballot. I suppose the convenience there would be, I can sit at home and fill out my ballot, take my time, Google a candidate or a ballot question while I'm doing that to try and learn more information, and then just take the ballot and go put it in the tabulator at the early voting site.
Great. And then the last one I'm seeing here right now is about the voter ID requirements. We thought that the change is that the voter ID is not required at the polls anymore. Is that what we voted to do, or is that a misunderstanding?
Yeah, so the proposal didn't change anything in terms of voter ID. Currently, state law, but even before 2022, Michigan state law requires voters to either show a photo ID or sign an affidavit attesting to their identity. And in the constitutional amendment that was approved, that was codified into the state constitution, that you have the option to show a photo ID or sign an affidavit attesting to your identity. The legislation that is being discussed right now expands what qualifies as acceptable photo ID. So it adds an ID from a school or an ID from a local government. So if you show up at your polling location and you don't have a different form of ID, but you have one of those, that would now count to fulfill that requirement. So it's not a change in terms of what is required. It just expands what counts as an acceptable ID.
Understood. And then I have a follow-up to the absentee ballots and tabulating those. Will that eliminate the requirement for absentee ballots being dropped off on election day to be tabulated at the precincts? Do you want me to read that?
Yeah, no, I'm trying to think through that one. I haven't seen anything to change that in the legislation. Yeah, that's what I'll say on that.
And then what does the impact of enlarging precincts have on the numbers of precinct captains? From your perspective, do many precinct captains have much to do with getting out the vote?
Yeah, so I would imagine if there's fewer precincts, then there'd be fewer precinct captains would be kind of a natural impact there. It's, it'll be interesting to see when at the implementation in the short term and long term, kind of what the impact is, because it's expanding the cap. So it's allowing municipalities to have fewer precincts if they choose. That doesn't necessarily mean that they will choose to do that. So it'll be interesting to see kind of what that actually looks like. And I don't know as far as the impact on precinct captains with getting out the vote. That'd be an interesting issue to kind of look more into.
Okay, and I think right now that's all, unless there's some, I understand that Prop 1 does not require the legislature to share their actual salary and income.
Yeah, so Proposal 1 requires them to report sources of income, but not the amount of income, if that helps. Now, for like actual legislative salary, you can look up, what a state legislator gets paid. But yeah, if they have a separate job or other sources of income, the disclosure form requires the sources of income as well. Now, what I'll say there is that's what the constitutional amendment requires. The legislature could, in their implementing legislation, require that the amount of income also be disclosed. That's one of those things where the constitutional amendment provides like the baseline for what the required disclosure is. The legislature could decide to include a whole lot more in that. They may not, they may. And that's kind of one of the decisions that they have to make as they implement that.
And then Cheryl has been following up on this and says, it may be somewhat rhetorical, but why is that? What are they afraid of?
That's a good question.
And I don't know, Jennifer, if you want to open it up to any other questions. Maybe one question following up some of these questions that I have is just what are some of the ways, so if we are hearing some things that maybe we're concerned about or wondering about, what are some ways that we could follow up to get more information or to share our opinions with legislators that might be effective?
Yeah, so right now is a great time to be calling legislative offices, emailing legislative offices as they're, getting ready to vote on these things probably in the coming days. I would say, right now in terms of staying up to date is be reading the news, looking for sources of news on this, because a lot of it is changing quickly as things go through the legislature. And probably a week from now, we'll have a lot clearer picture on what some of these things are going to look like kind of practically in terms of implementation. And if someone's really curious and wants to learn more about the whole process, reaching out to your county clerk or your city clerk is always a great way to really learn about kind of how that process works from beginning to end. And right now, I know our county clerk here in Ingham County, and I've talked to her, and she'll very openly share what some of the challenges are and what the concerns are in terms of the legislation that needs to get implemented to continue to keep Michigan's elections secure.
Well, thank you, Eric. If anyone does want to ask a question directly, feel free to go under reactions at the bottom of your screen and raise your hand. Otherwise,
It looks like Cheryl has another.
yes, I saw that.
Cheryl, do you want to unmute and ask your question yourself?
I guess that was one reason I voted for Proposition 1 was even more than the term limits. I wasn't convinced that would change anything really, but was the sunshine laws or things that really, I mean, that's something that the league has really been supportive of, and then I was really disturbed to see that their income wasn't part of that, because my understanding is that at the national level, the congressional offices have to talk about that. So I would like to just know why this was a minimal thing to get this whole term limits thing through, it seems to me. I'm sorry, I'm just giving you my opinion, which is not what anyone wants to hear, but tell me what, I guess part of it is, how is it related to FOIA? I hadn't thought about that issue. How is their reporting and FOIA? Does FOIA put more power into requiring a specific report from one of them or something like that?
No, they're not really directly related. It's more that because they both deal with transparency and just access to information, there's kind of some thought that forcing that because the constitutional amendment forces some conversation about implementing the financial disclosure reports while they're working on that aspect of transparency, they may, finally have a more serious conversation about expanding FOIA. It's one of those things that's been talked about. You hear certain lawmakers talk about it every year, and it hasn't really made progress as much in the last few years. But I think the thought is that maybe because they're talking about it with financial disclosure reporting, there may be some more interest in exploring that this year. So it's not a direct connection, but kind of one of those just like tangential related issues.
Thank you.
Yep.
All right, anyone else have a question or a comment?
Well, you
Thank
know, I do have one more thing. I'm sorry. Any rate, and I'm raising this because Tim Martin, who's on, was talking to our board about the fact that there is some legislation that I had not heard of that was trying to allow 16-year-olds to be able to get registered. And I don't know, Tim, if Eric, are you aware of that legislation out there and where it's at? Registered to vote. I'm sorry, didn't complete that.
Yeah, I don't think that that's included in any of the legislation that's moving right now. What I do know is there's like 15 to 20 states that do allow pre-registration of people under 18. So basically it allows them to register so that when they turn 18, they're automatically already registered. So that would be just another step to increase the number of people who are registered to vote, just removing that extra barrier. Now in Michigan, we already have automatic voter registration where, if you turn 18 and go get a new state ID or a new driver's license, you're automatically given the opportunity to register to vote when you do that. This would just kind of add an additional layer to that, where if your child turns 16 and gets a driver's license, they can pre-register so that when they turn 18, they don't have to do anything else. They're already registered to vote.
So that's related to the pre-license. They have to get a license to be able to register, or they can do that separately.
They would be able to do that separately. That was just kind of the example that came to mind. But that's not included in the legislation that's moving right now. That would be a separate bill that they may discuss. I've seen some conversation about it, but it's not part of the package being considered right now.
Okay, thank you.
All right, well, thank you. Thank you, Eric. Very clear presentation and very helpful, I think. This has been recorded. It will be available on the library's YouTube channel, our special League of Women Voters sub-channel, in a couple of weeks. It usually takes that long. If you want more information about anything, you can get in touch with me. I'm JDYE, DetroitPublicLibrary.org. And I should have just copied this here. Our next program will be July 11th. We're finalizing the topic and speaker. But if anyone wants any more information, please get in touch. It will be publicized through the league locally on the library's website. And you can get in touch with me as well if you'd like to. Thank you for attending, and thank you, Eric, again.
Yes.
Very clear presentation.
Thank you for having me.
Good night.
Good night.
Right.